Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the session Voices from South America. We would like to acknowledge that this conference is being hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, which is located in Manhattan, the traditional unceded territory of the Lenape. And now I will turn things over to our session chair, Liz Martin-RUIZ.
Good afternoon and welcome. Bienvenidos to the Voices from South America panel. It's going to take place today from 3 to 4. My name is Liz Martin-RUIZ, and I'll be chair for the panel. Today, we will hear 3 perspectives. All right, there's my video. Sorry about that. Today, we'll hear 3 perspectives on climate change in Latin America, ranging from creating an album inspired by Colombian indigenous water rights, perspectives on Avitourism in Colombia, and indigenous land rights in Suriname. Each panelist will give a 10-minute presentation, which will be followed by 10 minutes of questions. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and they'll be addressed in the question section after the presentation. First, we have Beatriz GOUBERT, whose paper is entitled Songs for the Younger Brothers, Native Ecological Knowledge Education to Save the Water in Bogotá. Beatriz GOUBERT holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from Columbia University. Her dissertation focuses on Andean popular music as strategy for indigenous revitalization and its legal recognition in Colombia. Her academic interests include popular music and culture in Latin America, digital humanities, and environment and politics. She currently serves as editor for the Latin America and the Caribbean at RILM, the International Database for Music Publications. She's also the Secretary General of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music. She has developed ethnographic archive digitization projects and has published in Latin American musical practices and cultural policies, including the book Universiteit, Músicas Urbanas, Pedagogia y Cotidianidad, and multiple articles and book chapters. Beatriz, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I want to start by thanking Michael and the wonderful team of people for making this conference possible despite COVID. Let me share then my screen. Hold on 1 second. This paper explores how the indigenous communities in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, Colombia, combat Anthropocene crisis through sound and music. These communities explain climate change as the result of human actions to the planet and use sound and music as means to reestablish the imbalance created by humans. I explore how female authorities embody this ontology in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Wiwa female authorities sing and dance to the sound of the drum to pay back to the planet and reestablish the cosmological order. I focus on Atiquiwa, an indigenous leader that translates this knowledge of environmental balance maintained through sound to protect the water sources in Bogotá. The Arhuaca female leader and first indigenous councilwoman in Bogotá, Atiquiwa, is highly known for her political commitment to environmental causes. Her initiatives include a water statute for the city of Bogotá and a referendum for the rights of nature. I will analyze the album Abre Sierra, Renace Boacatá that she and rock musician David Jaramillo produced in 2008. I argue that Atiquiwa translates the ontologies of the Sierra, where sound and music are the means to re-establish the ecological balance, into the 2008 album as a way to engage non-indigenous citizens in defending the water sources of Bogotá. 300 miles away from the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, in a very different place, the 10 million inhabitants of Bogotá face air and water pollution. Colombia's capital relies on a unique ecosystem called páramos for its water. The plants and moss in the páramo act like a sponge, trapping moisture from the foggy air, storing it in the soil during the dry season and releasing it gradually. The ecosystem, which is only found in Central and South America, is now under threat due to farming, coal mining, and climate change. On top of this, the Bogotá River, which could be another source of water, has been classified as one of the most contaminated rivers in the world. The critical situation of water endangers the well-being of the inhabitants. One of the basic premises of the ontology of the four indigenous groups of the Sierra is that humans are part of a larger community of living beings whose survival depends on the balance among them. These indigenous communities who live in the Sierra are in charge of caring for the relations with other beings and on guiding their younger brothers, on keeping the balance. The indigenous communities of the Sierra identify themselves as elder brothers and non-indigenous people as younger brothers. In this ontology, the damage caused by the younger brothers, childlike people who does not and cannot behave adequately, sickened Mother Earth, producing an imbalance in the world. Let's see how Wiwa female authorities explain the environmental task.
Maya ni kan gas kima jinji no pan kan waji kalga mba iskanaka iskanaji celular mba bigo manushi wala twati jinja maintenu kan me ko anjengian me mengi kima ima gega nu kwani nu kan waji iskanaji pungu yaki kalga shambuna wanka
la Maria Elena dingula na luga Kamba sewangelo saga jigina nuka nanka saga jingo gashkaro igu saga igu na yenu nuka nan chikingi nenjazi nukunka na reki mangon mama juisa na yengi mama na jemena abu na kura sambango jama yengi kimangon abu na nan kaushkat mama ngo jama yengi Majinilo, vai que jibonduna, saga jagino calo Jamaica, comunanga mapa, Jamaia, Cuia, negashkalo, Jamaia navi, chicane que jingalo Jamaia. Takango jingilo, mesmo jingilo, meme ia ancurash kango kimango seja. Ikiango ne knazi ke zigawi ngamaninga mango ke ga kurango nkamain pi kungazina lo ni populo ke tiwarga jana.
I have to thank indigenous filmmaker Rafa Mojica for lending me the image from his documentary. The sagas Wiwa female authorities have the task to protect nature. What they take from earth is repaid by singing and dancing. Now, with this very brief introduction to the Sierra Nevada multi-perspectivist ontology, let's focus on the work of our Waco leader, Atiquigua. As one of the cultural ambassadors of the Sierra, Atiquigua has been working. After she obtained her college degree, she continued her diplomatic work in Bogotá. Her task is to educate citizens about the ecological message of the Sierra. She had then to find a way to translate the indigenous ontologies of the Sierra for non-indigenous citizens in the capital city, many of whom are not aware of the indigenous ontologies or do not care about their ideas. Quigua resources to interculturality for this translation. Catherine Walsh describes interculturality, initially in the Ecuadorian indigenous movement, as a political and epistemic process and project that opposes colonialism and creates new sociopolitical structures, conditions, and relations between cultures in conflict. It proposes the construction of a new epistemological space that incorporates and negotiates indigenous and Western knowledge. Instead of reproducing the indigenous rituals of the elders of the Sierra Nevada, she recorded an album highly appealing for urban audiences. The title of the album clearly reflects her aim: Abre Sierra, Renace Bogotá, which can be translated as the Sierra opens up, Bogotá is reborn, suggests that sharing the indigenous knowledge of the elders of the Sierra will contribute to Bogotá's rebirth into a more environmentally sustainable city. This album was produced by an intercultural team. 52 mestizo and indigenous musicians participated in the recording. Renowned artists such as Manu Chao, Carlos Vives, or Andrea Echeverri, just to name a few, cover a wide range of musical genres of the Colombian music industry in the last 20 years. The musicians used a variety of ways to mix popular genres with indigenous traditions. While some of the tracks have an upfront ethnic sound, in others, ethnic musicians collaborate in a pop or reggae song. In others, collaboration is among indigenous musicians without much intervention of pop styles. The song Todos a Tierra, or All for Earth, perhaps the most popular song of the album, is also the most cooperatively conceived song as it mixes several music styles and performers in contrasting sections. The introduction, chorus and conclusion in Todos a Tierra present an Andean melody in quena. The intermediate section presents contrasting genres such as reggae, vallenato, and cumbia. In the middle of the song, Atiquigua gives a speech in Iku, the Arhuaco language, and Spanish about the importance of caring for Ati, Mother Earth. I'm going to put an example to show the chorus, and then you listen to the words with a cumbia background.
Aquí todos te necesitamos, yeah. A ti aire, a ti sol, a ti agua, todos a tierra, que nazca la paz. A ti aire, a ti sol, a ti agua, todos a tierra, hijos de suma paz. A ti aire, a ti sol, a ti agua, todos a tierra para que nazca la paz. A ti aire, a ti sol, a ti agua, todos a tierra, hijos de suma paz. Sí, sí. ¡Ay, hombre! Cantando hace
Sina majina zimezanuku Nundi Atiquigua zakinukwani Aviri jo avik munukunu kwawani Mai kunukuzuna pauru ni bizaisi Akinzu mivikaibu.
This album, addressed to mestizo citizens, embodies the indigenous ontologies of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Quigua is very aware of the ontological difference between the indigenous communities and the mestizo society in Bogotá, and decides to address the problem of water in the city, where she governs as part of the council. She addresses it via reconciling the indigenous multinatural ontology and the mestizo anthropocentric ontology through interculturality. She knows that the knowledge to balance the planet, which rests on the shoulders of natives in the Sierra Nevada, is not enough unless it is brought outside of the Sierra and into the city. And part of the sonic strategy for regaining the balance is translating the rituals performed in the Sierra by the female spiritual authorities into a successful album of popular music. Also, the album, as a central component of her intercultural politics, exemplifies an inversion of power in the Colombian society. Historically, mestizos have held political power, frequently ignoring other types of subaltern knowledge, such as that of indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, and Quigua is promoting alternative political forms to reconcile indigenous and Western thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatriz. Here we go. Here's my video. Thank you, Beatriz, for that that presentation. I find it so interesting, the all the dualities going on there, but the bringing together that this activist has done And I'm really curious to hear if you have, if now we have some time has passed, that you have some idea of this inclusion of intercultural mix of musicians and activists on the album, if that has ended up being successful and that she's been able to reach a larger audience with this album. And if so, I'm also just curious if that translates into a different reaction or between the mestizo populations and the indigenous populations to the album.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a great question. Yeah, the reception of the album was quite successful. There were a series of tours that they did with the album, nationally, internationally. I can remember when they played this song, the example that I showed during Rock al Parque, which is the largest rock festival in Colombia, outdoors, and people just went crazy. The relationship between Ati and the other musician stopped there in the album, but she's continued doing a lot of cultural activities to promote her environmental campaign. And there was an album recorded, I think in 2011, that followed this same path. So the idea was to take indigenous music from the different regions in Colombia and set it with rock music in an attempt to catch the attention of mestizo citizens about the environmental situation in Colombia.
Wow, she doesn't give up. Great. Well, I invite questions to the Q&A section from our attendees. And if there aren't, yeah, so please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're unfamiliar, look down there and you'll be able to type in your question in the Q&A. In the meantime, I have another question for Beatriz, which is, what did Ati-Kigwa hope to achieve with the CD? Were there specific water policies that she was looking to bring attention to with the album, besides just kind of the awareness of the issue in general?
Well, yeah, she was trying to raise money to support projects that were clearing water sources in Bogotá, and also she was trying to use some of the money to support indigenous communities in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. The indigenous communities of the Sierra Nevada in Colombia are particularly popular cultural ambassadors with European countries, so they are very wise in collecting money from European countries. So that was part of it. And yeah, she's been developing also a lot of projects. One of the projects that people recalls her most is a law that she passed a couple of years ago, where people with the lowest income in Bogotá wouldn't have to pay for the first 200 cubic meters of water. So those were free for them, because in Bogotá and in Colombia, you have to pay a lot of money for water. It's part of your monthly bills. So she got that bill passed, and that was really good for the city.
Amazing. We do have a question. This comes from Jane Sugarman. She says, thank you very much, Beatriz. To what extent do her albums preach to the converted? Is there evidence that her productions have recruited new groups of citizens to be aware of environmental policies? Have her songs been taken up in more direct political contexts?
Oh, thanks for that question. That's very important. It's very difficult to trace if she has gone beyond preaching the converted. But I think the fact that she was first elected in 2008 to 2012 as a councilwoman, and then re-elected for the 2020-2023 period, is part of this. The songs have been more successful, or not more, but have been equally successful outside of Colombia. So that's also an important part, because as long as we have international observers pressuring for referendums for water and bills for the water in Bogotá, that also helps the local community. But the fact that she was re-elected, I think, counts a lot for her stewardship in water.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Beatriz. I really appreciate your time and sharing all your knowledge today. I'm going to move on to our next panelist in the interest of time. Our next panelist, our next panelist is Juan Velázquez, presenting a paper entitled The Call of the CDD, Post-Conflict, Avitourism, Biodiversity, and Epistemologies of Sound in 21st Century Colombia. Juan Velázquez is lecturer at the Universiteit de Antioquia and Instituto Técnico Metropolitano. He also holds a PhD in musicology with certificates in Latin American and cultural studies from the University of Pittsburgh, and was postdoctoral scholar at the Michigan Society of Fellows. His articles have appeared in journals like Latin American Music Review and the Boletín de Música de Casa de las Américas. Velázquez is also the incoming chair of the Ibero-American Music Study Group at the American Musicological Society. Again, please write your questions in the Q&A section, and they will be addressed in the questions section after the presentation. Juan, I hand the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really glad to be here, and I want to join to my colleague Beatriz to express my gratitude to Michael Lupo and his wonderful team who have been working so hard to make possible this space. Thank you again. I also want to invite everyone to watch the full presentation. The video is available on the link that I shared a week ago with the conference site, but I will present a short version for issue of time and to be concise. Then in this paper, I will examine the sonic epistemologies beneath the presence of a bird known in Colombia as Sirirí, a member of the Tiranidae family of flycatchers. And I'm particularly interested in the work of two Colombian artists, Ana Maria Romano and Edson Belandia. By combining the works of Romano and Belandia, I analyze how listening to this bird conjoins sound and memory in a way that calls into question the boundaries separating human from non-human, nature from culture, and people from territory. Thus, I introduce a three-part analysis. First, I analyze how bird songs in Romano's work can reveal listening preferences connecting memory, sound, affect, and space. Later, I inquire how Belandia's song illustrates the city's totemic value as a symbol of resistance within post-agreement Colombia. Then, I contrast such epistemologies with the dominant narratives of biodiversity as presented by the blueprint of an aviotouristic industry in the country. El suelo desde el viento, the land from the wind, is an electroacoustic piece by the Colombian sonic artist Ana Maria Romano. Romano, one of the most prominent sonic artists of her generation, also directs En Tiempo Real, on real time, a feminist platform that reunites Latin American women making experimental music that explores the political dimensions of the multiple intersections that exist between sound and technology. An spectrogram of this work reveals that bird songs have a recurrent presence on Romano's piece, accomplishing a structural function by providing key sounds that connect a series of electroacoustic interventions since the beginning of the piece. In this spectrogram, the bird songs are represented with the yellow circles, while the other sounds are represented with the green squares. Let's listen a little bit of the piece. In my case, the bird calls call my attention. This made me think about the structural role that the bird songs played on El Suelo desde el Viento, and how it invites some listeners to perceive multiple sonic layers that can recall memories and reveal sonic preferences. Hence, my experience listening to Romano's piece exemplifies how, for some listeners, the bird song's footprint in this piece transformed them from background sounds into a feature that attracts and directs the listener's attention. Such a familiarity recalls a series of representations and symbolic values that delineate the relationship between humans and the Sirirí in a given context. Indeed, for some people, listening to the Sirirí in Romano's piece also becomes an experience conjoining sound and memory, so that the affective mind of the listener recalls and inscribes meanings based on personal experiences and cultural frameworks. I was thinking about this issue when the Sirirí's call emerged again in my life. In December of 2019, the Colombian singer and composer Edson Belandia, really prominent in the country as one of the leaders of the protest movement, uploaded to Facebook and Instagram the song El Sirirí El Paro, the strikes click, click, click. In this song, Belandia showed his support for the national strike, an ongoing social uprising that began in November 21st of 2019, when more than 200,000 Colombians took to the streets in several cities to express distinct grievances directed against President Iván Duque's administration. These grievances include, but are not restricted to, changes in social policies, the slow implementation of the peace agreement, the alarming increase in the murders of social and environmental leaders, and the official supports of fracking. In Belandia's song, the antiphon click, 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 which imitates the three-section call of this bird, represents the protesters' annoying persistence. Let's hear a little bit of the song.
Amorcito, yo te quiero, eso vos lo tienes claro. Nos pillamos en la clase, nos flechamos en el paro. Clic, 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 clic. El que es bueno para el amor, mire cómo se apechuga. Y el que es bueno para el camino, en la marcha no se arruga. Clic, 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 clic. ¿Qué tal?
The comparison between the protesters and the bird, it is possible, because humans sharing the territory with this bird have observed a particular behavior. The Sirirí is a highly territorial species that doesn't avoid any conflict with any other bird in entering to their territory. Indeed, they attack even larger birds as hawks. Belandia's song and my experience listening to Romano's work indicate that the Sirirí and its call have become what Philippe Descola describes as a totem. Hence, in Colombia, the Sirirí's call is a sign used to establish models that explain social relations through the transference of animal behaviors that metaphorically exemplify human behaviors and values. As theorized by Descola, in such a mode of representation, The difference between species becomes a model of social distinction. Consequently, the continuity between human and non-human forms of materiality and interiority shapes such a metaphorical relationship between nature and culture. The Sirirí's symbolic value as a totem is crucial to understand why different social movements use this bird as a symbol of resistance. In post-agreement Colombia, this network of symbolic representations has become instrumental for victims' associations that have embraced the Sirirí as a symbol of protective motherhood, central for their pursuit of truth, justice, and reparation. A case in point is Fabiola Lalinde's Operation Sirirí. Ms. Lalinde is presented in this slide. The totemic value of the Sirirí as a symbol of resistance in post-agreement Colombia significantly differs from the value assigned to birds within official ecotouristic plans embraced by the Colombian institutions and promoted by local and international NGOs, such as the Audubon Society. This blueprint exploits biodiversity to foster economic growth, particularly via the promotion of Avitourism. The Colombian Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Tourism established in 2017 a series of alliances with different organizations and touristic agencies, aiming to exploit the local avian diversity to develop the Colombian ecotouristic sector after the peace agreement signature. The Colombian Avitouristic Blueprint responds to the UN's definition of biodiversity. The UN's Convention on Biological Diversity introduced a language that intertwines science, conservation, and economic growth to commodify non-human beings. From this standpoint, birds become valuable tokens in an economic model that, as theorized by Arturo Escobar, uses biodiversity to capitalize nature as a commodity, making possible the management of non-human beings and ecosystems that support discourses of sustainable development. Indeed, many promoters of Avitourism often declare that this branch of ecotourism is a sustainable economic activity that seems to encourage the protection and conservation of fragile ecosystems by producing revenue for local communities. However, this narrative relies on a series of assumptions and denials. For example, it assumes that there's an equal distribution of revenue and benefits among the different actors participating in avitouristic ventures, such as touristic agencies, guides, private reserves, NGOs, and local communities. Besides, promoters of avitourism often suggest that it is an alternative to the poverty ravaging the exotic avitouristic destinations, usually located in the global south. This implies that the inhabitants of these territories have widely embraced the notions of development and economic growth designed and developed in the global north. In conclusion, the different epistemologies and ontologies of sound examined in this paper introduce new questions about how our listening habits and responses connect acoustic ecology and listening, while orally introducing birds and humans who coexist in the same space at the same time, but in a different manner. Avitourism promotes listening to birds as an experience implicated in notions of difference that separate nature and culture. By doing this, it inserts biodiversity in a global economy of difference. In contrast, an analysis of Romanos and Belandia's works reveals that there is an epistemology of sound based on familiarity and resiliency rather than rarity and uniqueness. Such a difference points to the limits of the epistemologies supporting a neoliberal notion of biodiversity. Avitourism might be beneficial for local communities and ecosystems if the redistribution of revenue reaches them. However, a model of sustainable use of nature that commodifies and exploits non-human species without considering how they are central for other forms of learning and experiencing the world hardly brings equity and prosperity. we need to recognize the flaws and limitations of an avitouristic model based on a neo-extractivist economy of diversity that exploits the exotic charming of charismatic species. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. I invite participants to put their questions in the Q&A section. I'll start with one of my own. Juan, your presentation and musical examples really represented a clear dichotomy between nature and culture, tourist and local perspectives. It's so clear. I really appreciate that. And furthermore, the implications of these songs and sounds, what that means for each side of those dichotomies. And you gave some examples of what local musicians are seeing there. I wondered if you could also give us some examples of how the Sirirí or birds or avitourism is viewed by tourists as a opposite from that.
Yes, thank you so much for this question, Elizabeth. It is wonderful. I will say that what I am studying right now about the logic of avitouristic ventures is the principal audience of these ventures in not only in Colombia. I will say that in any major avitouristic destination. You see that on some places in Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, and Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, in South America, and Southeast Asia in some areas too, and Thailand. They are starting to notice that. The center of all the experience of the birder or the bird watcher, especially the model that they have, it's the American or the European bird watcher. And the basis of the experience of the bird watcher is building a list, what they call a life list. Then instead, it is an interesting transformation of this 19 colonial experience of traveling around and hunting and bringing the dead bodies of these animals to museums or private collections. Instead that now birders travel to these destinations and take pictures and make recordings, and they include these observations on this live list. You even can post that on apps. There's an app developed by the Cornell and the Ornithological Lab. And you enter the data, the observation, the picture, everything. And what gives you more value and the community, the birding, in the community of bird watching, it is how many different species, and especially in the endemic and rare birds do you have in your list. However, there is a clear preference for species that are charming. They should be colorful, sing beautifully, or just being strange and difficult to see or to watch. And that increases the value. And that positions Colombia in a quite privileged place in this economy, as this is the country that has more species registered at this point, more than 2,000. While in all North America, there is only 400. And many of these species are endemic, around 20% of the species are endemic, then you just can't see them here. And many of them are, the irony of this is the conflict preserve large areas in Colombia, relatively untouched. And then you can see these birds in areas where, really endangered species, in areas that used to be places like really, really bad to travel a few years ago. Unfortunately, things are not as stable as they should be. But that is the center of this. It's attracting international tourism to generate revenue in this area, these areas. And at the center of this is these birds as tokens to attract this particular consumer, I will say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm sure there's, as you say, there's another side to that too, which is environmental impact and other things like that. So, wow, a lot to unpack there. Thank you, but that's really interesting. We have one question from Rupert Cox. He says, thanks Juan for your talk. What do you make of the connections being made between avitourism and reconciliation by guides like Diego Calderon, who has become quite well known for doing this?
Thank you so much for your question, Rupert. It is a fantastic question, and I really appreciate that you brought Diego Calderon to this conversation. Diego is an ornithologist, and his personal life history, in some way, posed him in a quite interesting place. He was kidnapped by the guerrilla while researching birds in some areas in the Colombian Caribbean, and then he became, aware of the necessity of involving these local communities in these experiences. And I will say that his work is a leader in trying to involve more actively people that participated in the conflict before, because he's aware of something. This is, at the end of the day, this people is the people that is living next to these birds. They know a lot of these birds, their behavior, and then he has been working actively to promote Avitourism with active participation of former members of the guerrillas and the paramilitary. Say that, unfortunately, I will say that is the exception to the rule. What the model basically in Colombia now is dominated by a series of companies or entrepreneurs that have connections with some touristic agencies. The model that prevails is one they experience around big cities. And in a few cases, in some hotspots for bird watching, as the Sierra Nevada. But unfortunately, due to the actual politics of the government that we have right now, the implementation of the agreements has been so slow that projects as the one led by Diego, it is not working as they should be.
Great. Thank you, Juan. In the interest of time, we're going to have to move on, but thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for your questions and for making possible this space.
All right. Our next panelist is Emily Clark. We're going to play a video of her presenting her paper, Colonialism and Climate Change, Listening to Culture and Nature in Suriname. Emily is a postdoctoral researcher working at Vrije University in Amsterdam and the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision. She holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from Columbia University with a focus on music, sound, and migration in the former Dutch colonial empire. I'm going to play her video presentation in just a moment, but Emily is here and she will be available for questions after if we have time.
Hi, I'm Emily Clark. I'll just start by saying thanks to Michael Lupo for organizing this, this great conference, and thanks for having me as a participant. And I will just get right into my paper, which is called Colonialism and Climate Change, Listening to Culture and Nature in Suriname. The country of Suriname has been called the most forested land in the world, with tropical forest covering 93% of its surface area of 64,000 square miles, a total land area slightly smaller than the state of Wisconsin. The former Dutch colony on the Caribbean coast of South America recently joined the UN initiative reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, known as REDD+, which is a sort of large-scale carbon offset program, and Suriname is currently in the late readiness phase of REDD+. The adoption of REDD+ should be understood within a problematic history of natural extraction and conservation, which have both been tied to the dispossession and displacement of Suriname's interior dwelling populations, namely a number of different indigenous and Afro-descendant Maroon groups. Suriname is the only nation in the Americas to have no formal or legal recognition of land rights for indigenous and tribal people, including Suriname's many groups of Maroons. Instead, these groups have been repeatedly forced off their ancestral lands for mining, logging, flooding to create energy reservoirs, and even in the name of conservation. One social scientist and human rights lawyer, Ellen Rose Campbell, describes a sentiment she frequently encountered among Surinamese politicians and city dwellers as Amerindians don't do anything with the forest, so why should we give them land rights? And in these images, you can see two projects that displaced indigenous and maroon groups, the Brokopondo Reservoir on the left, which was flooded in the 1960s to provide energy for an aluminum plant, and the Central Suriname Nature Reserve, which was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in the year 2000, and as part of its preservation, has affected indigenous groups' abilities to hunt and fish and other forms of dwelling there. Scholars such as the anthropologist Mark Brightman have described carbon offset programs like REDD+ as new forms of extraction that similarly threaten the sovereignty and human rights of people who dwell in Suriname's forests, buttressed by neocolonial relations as the natural resources of the global south are used to offset the high consumption lifestyles of countries in the global north. In this paper, I use a sound studies approach to trace a line from colonial history to present day dispossession and displacement of particular groups in Suriname. I'm interested in the historical role of sound and listening in the formation of Suriname's celebrated but fundamentally unequal, ethnically plural society. I now jump back over a century to 1883 in Amsterdam, where a display of imported bodies, objects, and practices shows how Europeans understood nature, culture, and difference across colonial geographies. I propose that this is something that the study of music and sound has to offer to understanding and responding to climate change and its attendant inequalities. Namely, as Steve Feld puts it, I'm attempting to, quote, listen to a history of listening, end quote, a history of the senses documented in writing and images that connects colonial listening to contemporary perceptions of nature, culture, and human difference. I propose that in late 19th century acts of European listening, we can hear epistemologies of extractivism and inequality, ideas about which groups of people are able to make something of their natural and sonic resources. A history of listening that points to deeply ingrained notions that lie at the foundations of contemporary approaches to managing nature, and that connect projects of resource extraction and even conservation to structures of difference, inequality, and colonial power. For 6 months in 1883, the International Colonial and Export Exhibition took place behind the grand new building of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam on what's now the grassy museum square. It drew 1.5 million visitors to Amsterdam, which had a population of 300,000 at the time. The Netherlands colonial holdings took center stage, which made sense, given that it was a small country whose main claim to being a modern European power was imperial expansion rather than domestic industry. On display were ethnographic artifacts, plants, and animal specimens collected from its colonized regions, as well as living human beings. Native villages presenting non-European humans in their natural habitat had been a minor feature of previous international exhibitions and an attraction at European fairs and zoos. But in Amsterdam, the colonies, and particularly these immersive living exhibits of daily life there, formed for the first time a central spectacle. You can see the Indies exhibit at the bottom of this image. The Netherlands' two most significant colonies, the East Indies, now Indonesia, and Suriname in the West Indies or Caribbean, were both on display, though in rather different ways. The East Indies Park, highlighted here, seen and heard immediately upon entry, featured a kampung or village comprised of houses in various traditional styles from Java, Sumatra, and Sulawesi, plants and animals imported from the tropics, and a small open pavilion with a Javanese gamelan ensemble, a traditional pitch percussion orchestra. To the sounds of the gamelan, 38 people from Java and Sumatra lived in the structures of the Indies Park for 6 months, tending live buffalo and gardens and carving furniture, weaving textiles, and dyeing batik for the benefit of onlookers. This is a rendering by a visiting Dutch artist, and you can see it's perhaps a bit romanticized. You don't see evidence that this is taking place in the Netherlands at all. It just looks like it is in Java. And you can see a gamelan player in the front right of this image. The sonic magic of the live gamelan featured in journalists and other visitors' recounts of the display, such as this passage. From the pavilion reverberates the secretive music of the gamelan, a mysterious, plaintive drone, which mimics the natural sounds of the Indies forest. Dancers dressed in dark brown sarong, waving their thin selendang, weave back and forth to the strange beat, and when the gamelan occasionally plays in the evening, one can picture a Javanese night and imagine oneself transported under glorious blue-green foliage or a copse of slim palms. On the opposite side of the park, where the arrow is on the right, far from the main entrance where the gamelan could be heard, the Suriname natives exhibit occupied a closed round circus tent in a remote corner of the expansive exhibition. This smaller exhibit housed 28 people brought by ship from Suriname. They included representatives from the Kalinya and Lokono, then called Carib and Arawak Amerindian tribes, the Njuka and Saramaka groups of Maroons, as well as Creoles, who are descendants of people who were freed when slavery was abolished in 1863. Like the residents of the Indies Park, these different groups of Surinamese natives, as they were labeled, dressed in their respective traditional clothing, built their own homes in the exhibit out of materials brought from Suriname, and engaged in woodworking and other crafts surrounded by an arrangement of imported plants and ethnographic artifacts. The Amsterdam exhibition was the first to use an elaborate classification system to document the items, including the humans on display. In the over 800-page catalog, items are categorized in 3 groups. 1, the nature of the colonized and subjugated regions. 2, the native people of the colonized and subjugated regions. And 3, the Europeans in the colonies and their relations with the natives. The people category contains ethnographic artifacts, including musical instruments. The actual living humans on display were assigned to the nature category, subsection anthropology. Within this section, the occupants of the Indies Park and the occupants of the Suriname exhibit are described quite differently. Here on the right, you can see that the inhabitants or inlanders from the Dutch East Indies are listed by name, occupation, and place of origin. The list of gamelan musicians also includes which instrument they each played. In contrast, the group of Surinamese people, termed natives or inboorlingen rather than inhabitants, are only described at the group level with short ethnological essays about Suriname's indigenous and Maroon populations. No individuals are mentioned, and the urban Creole Surinamers are not even mentioned at all. Next to this classificatory system, there are other ways that scientific knowledge was derived from these exhibits. At the Suriname exhibit, for example, Roland Bonaparte, a French anthropologist, compiled anthropometric data, such as skull measurements, on each individual in the display. Bonaparte also staged a series of scientific photos showing each subject from front and in profile against a white backdrop. In Bonaparte's book, there are also drawings that include musical instruments, the drums of the Maroons and Amerindians, but these are mostly relegated to the backdrop, part of the landscape of flora, fauna, homes, and craft work that the inhabitants of the exhibit occupied. In Bonaparte's descriptions of Amerindians and Maroons, he briefly refers to the indigenous instruments like the Kalinya drum as crude and to Maroon music as monotone. This is consistent with other scholarship of the time. The first tomes on Javanese music by the Orientalist P.J. Beth had recently been published, while Surinamese music making was, until about the mid-20th century, only passingly mentioned in travelogues, again, part of the sort of backdrop or landscape to human subsistence in the Caribbean. Bonaparte's anthropological documentation of the Surinamers on display provides a striking visual comparison to the records of the kampung on the other side of the fairgrounds. Despite the presence of a number of ethnologists alongside other European researchers, no such anthropometric photographs were taken of the inhabitants of the Indies Park. But there was this series of photos taken in a similar scientific style that featured the instruments of the gamelan. Like the human beings in the Suriname exhibit, each instrument was isolated against a portable white backdrop and photographed from different angles. These sets of scientific photographs taken at the Suriname Natives exhibit and the Indies Park, each with their individual specimens isolated and documented for scientific investigation, give quite clear evidence of the differential ways that these two groups and their bodies and practices were perceived by Europeans. While in the Indies Park, culture in the form of textiles and woodwork, architecture, food, and especially music, puppetry, and dance was on display. In the Suriname exhibit, it was human bodies and characteristics that journalists and researchers described and measured in detail. The difference in these two objects of scientific study, in one case, musical instruments, in the second, human bodies, is quite telling. From the Dutch East Indies, Europeans could learn about culture and cultural difference. From the Dutch West Indies, Europeans could learn about human nature and natural difference. Through both, Europeans assembled an image of their own cultural and natural history, difference, and superiority compared to the rest of the world. These three historical depictions of musical instruments capture different ideas about music, nature, culture, and knowledge. In the first drawing, from the Suriname display, musical instruments are part of the landscape. Drums using materials from non-human nature are depicted as part of daily life, ritual, and survival in Black and Indigenous life, alongside other forms of woodworking and crafts. They remain mostly silent in the historical record, and when described, they are crude and produce monotone sound. In the second picture, depicting a gamelan player in the East Indies exhibit, cultural practice is put on stage as a central object of spectatorship, though it's not depicted as separated from the natural landscape, which still surrounds it. Rather, as in many descriptions of the gamelan in colonial Dutch scholarship, one hears reference to the raw sonic materials of nature and how Indonesian people are able to use them to make music. This occurs through processes of mimesis, adaptation, and embellishment, extracting melody and harmony from the sounds of the forest, wind, waterfalls, and birds. What is perhaps significant here is that the inhabitants of the East Indies are heard by the European ear as being able to take their natural surroundings and to make something of them, harnessing the raw sonic materials provided by nature, and out of them achieving melody, harmony, or culture. In the third photo, perhaps we can say that what we see depicted here is knowledge, or a particular ideology of it, namely modern European scientific knowledge as the isolation, measurement, labeling, and thus control of the object, the removal of the object from context in order to consume the thing as the knowable. And in a sense, this is the whole idea of the native village display at the colonial European exhibition, to extract people, nature, and sensory experiences from the colonies for Europeans to perceive, consume, and make knowledge from them. Of course, all three of these representations depict the white European gaze, photographs and drawings by Dutch and other Europeans. And this is how the colonial exhibition has often been parsed in scholarship, as a way of constructing the European subject, knowing the other in order to better know oneself. At the same time, through sensory display, consumption, and scholarship, the European exhibition served to structure a hierarchy of colonial difference that had and still has real material effects for many in the global South. In my research, I attend to a history of migration, labor, and colonial policy that connects these epistemologies of nature and culture with Suriname's contemporary post-colonial forms of multiculturalism and resource management. For the sake of this 20-minute presentation, I am going to skip over more than a century of history that I elsewhere connect in a more continuous and expanded way. So see my forthcoming article for more. To put this very briefly for now, when slavery ended in the Dutch Caribbean in 1863, contract laborers from Asia, including Indonesia, were brought to Suriname by choice or by coercion to replace the labor of freed Afro-descendants on Surinamese plantations. My research goes on to investigate what happens when Javanese people came to Suriname. And what I find is that there was basically a full rearranging of colonial policy and life, really, as Surinamese society changed to include Asian groups of people with a different epistemological status from the Afro-descendant population in the eyes of the governing Europeans. This, I argue, comes down to the idea that Indonesian people actually had culture, tradition, and history as they were displayed at the colonial exhibition, unlike how Europeans perceived Afro-descendants at the time. While Black religious and cultural traditions, such as Winti trancing practices, were outlawed for a century in Suriname, Asian traditions of music and religion, which have been documented and studied by Dutch anthropologists in the East Indies, were allowed and even promoted as forms of entertainment to help retain workers in set-apart Javanese villages in Suriname. And I argue that the subsequent changes in labor and cultural policy created the epistemological underpinnings for Suriname's present-day form of multiculturalism, or ethnic plurality, as it's sometimes called. So obviously too much to cover here, but I get into that more deeply elsewhere. And to sort of represent this history, this is an image of the first gamelan ensemble in Suriname, which was imported by the management of the plantation that employed the most Indonesian contract laborers. At present, individual social and political life in Suriname reflects particular notions about nature and culture that can be traced far back beyond the country's independence in 1975. A colonial system that governed Black, Indigenous, Asian, European, and other groups separately in terms of physical space and separate policies gave birth to Suriname's contemporary political system, where political parties are formed along the lines of ethnic solidarity and clientelism. Suriname celebrates its ethnic plurality with a yearly agenda of national holidays, where its different ethnic groups perform their histories of migration and cultural distinctiveness through music and dance as essential parts of the country's particular recipe or flavor of Caribbean multiculturalism. And this has been studied by various ethnomusicologists and anthropologists, including a recent book by Karina Campbell about Maroon participation, or Paul Chon-Sifat's work on Suriname's Chinese population. They both investigate the role of music and dance in the performance of an ambivalent, sometimes tense, rigid politics of ethnic and cultural plurality. Economically, Suriname relies on a deeply extractivist economy that shifted during the 20th century from plantation agriculture to the mining and extraction of bauxite, timber, oil, and gold, among other substances. This is also governed by the country's system of ethnic politics and power. Further, the notion of who is able to exploit the raw materials of nature and turn them into economic resources continues to be a structuring ideology for how different groups are permitted to engage with the non-human environment and the extractivist economy. Again, to return to the beginning of this paper, I repeat the widespread sentiment quoted by the anthropologist Ellen Rose Campbell: Amerindians don't do anything with the forest, so why should we give them land rights? I want to end on this notion of extracting and making, which connects a colonial history of European listening to the continued inequality embedded in natural resource management in Suriname today. From plantation agriculture to bauxite mining to REDD+, the power to manage the environment is afforded to those who are seen as able to take advantage of it, to extract value, and to make something of it in ways that participate in larger global economies of extraction and exchange. Two fundamental principles connect colonialism and climate change: the idea that we should harness nature and make things of it, and that different groups of people in the world have different levels of ability to do this. In Suriname's colonial history, we hear this also in sound. Different concessions are afforded by Europeans to those who can harness the sonic resources of nature and turn them into recognizable music, and those who can't, or to put it differently, those whose practices of sounding and dwelling are something other than this. To make such ideological histories audible, to quote Feld again, to listen to histories of listening, is one step that music and sound studies can contribute towards understanding the linkage between environmental exploitation, climate crisis, and the deeply unequal distribution of its causes and effects, historically and in the present. By listening through historical documents, in this case through the ears of Europeans, we can hear the colonial and the post-colonial, the great divide of nature and culture, and the distribution of difference in power, both within big issues like climate change and in contemporary everyday life. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
We have just a few minutes. If someone has a question, please put it in the Q&A. I'll wait just a few moments to see if we have a question pop up, but I certainly have one if not.
I've already taken more than my allotted time, obviously, so I'm also happy to continue the conversation by email or whatever. But I'd also love to hear any questions that people may have. So.
Yeah, you can find Emily's contact information in the program. Well, I'll just go ahead and say I found this so interesting. As a student of Latin American music, we've studied, you know, Spanish, French, English, Portuguese, even South Asian migration and different, you know, plural communities in the Caribbean. But I have to say that I don't get the education about the Dutch. And so this was really informative and a really interesting and unique situation that you have there. I was curious if, so thank you for that. I was curious if you have any information about what kind of voice these communities might have now. Like you mentioned, there's the national holidays where they perform. And so if I'm curious, if climate change and land ownership issues are a concern, and if they have a platform like these holidays or some other occasion where they're able to have agency.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a really good point. That I think the Dutch colonial history of the Caribbean and especially of South America is, you know, it doesn't receive like a lot of scholarly attention, and I think that. So this idea of sort of ethnic plurality in Suriname, it's like a different formulation, a different sort of colonial historical recipe for, I think, many of the same issues that other Caribbean and Latin American countries face. So there's a lot of similar things. And then there's a lot of like, maybe a particular Dutch kind of flavor to it, including that there is a diaspora of people of Indonesian descent because of those colonial connections across the Dutch Empire. Yeah, so in contemporary times, so it is still a huge problem in Suriname that indigenous and tribal people, like the groups of, they're still called Maroons in Suriname, don't have rights to their own land. And as I mentioned, that they've really, you know, been displaced by a number of projects, both in terms of resource extraction and in terms of even conservation projects. So yeah, so in terms of kind of having a voice in society, it's really structured by this idea of ethnic plurality that contains a lot of inequality. So there's a lot of celebration of, and I'm sure this sounds familiar from other places as well, but celebration of difference as though it's like equal where it's not really equal. So yeah, this that the national schedule of holidays of like the arrival of different migrant groups in Suriname, and now just more recently, indigenous and maroon populations also kind of get their own day, but that's just within the last 5 to 10 years or so, is a really good kind of microcosm of that ethnic plurality idea, I think, because there is this sort of public facing stage, there's like a particular day, there's events that have to do with it. At the same time, a lot of that ends up being quite inward facing to the own community. And especially for the indigenous and maroon events, they usually take place like far from the city. They don't have the same kind of city space, like a cultural center that the other groups in Suriname do. So you can see very clearly also these differences within this structure for sort of equal celebration and like having a voice, we could put it, you know, sort of performing their contribution to diversity in Suriname, that also faces a lot of structural differences between the different groups. So that's what I would say. I'm sure that resonates with the situation in many other places, you know, all over the world. But yeah, that's very clear in Suriname, I think. And the problem of land rights is, I think, yeah, you know, yeah, Suriname is, I think, the only place in Latin America that has no recognition of indigenous land rights, unfortunately. So I guess the question is that sort of having a voice, you know, really heard, let's say, or what kind of agency does this kind of structured celebration within the national paradigm really accomplish?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's a lot more to keep researching here too. So anyway, thank you so much, Emily.
Thanks. And yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat, so maybe it's time to wrap things up. But of course, I'd love to hear people's questions at a later time as well.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Emily and all the participants today. I've learned so much, and I appreciate you taking the time to share it today. Thank you to the participants for your questions, and I hope that you will continue to follow up with our participants. If you have questions, you can find their contact information in the program. And lastly, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for putting this together on such a timely subject.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks so much, guys. Once again, I would just like to thank Beatriz, Juan, Emily, and Liz for a fantastic panel. I really appreciate everything. At this point, we're going to end this session and just take a short break. And we will return at 4:30 to play a message from composer John Luther Adams. So I will see you all then.